Welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit about solving tone problems in conjunction with my saxophone pedagogy book. This is really just an oral demonstration of a lot of things that are discussed at length in the chapter in my book on solving tone problems. But you need to hear some of the things that I'm talking about there. So this is coordinated to that book. Please check the book out so that you understand I'm not doing everything here that's in the book. I'm telling you here some of the oral examples that you need to hear. And I have to make the point that you can't expect to work on tone with a young student if they've never heard a good tone. So you should play for them a lot in the lessons, demonstrate, model. But you should also get them listening. They should be hearing good tone all the time. So it gets programmed into their mind and they can hear it in their mind's ear every time they play, not that tone. Or, hey, I'm getting closer. And so I think that we've got to get them listening to good sound. I don't think you're going to make it to bass one if they haven't ever heard a good sound. I don't know what they're aiming at. Let's go into, I think, one of the most important parts of getting a good sound, which is that the notes need to be centered. We call it centering. In physics or acoustics, they call this maximum resonancy. Or we reach the note's natural frequency where it vibrates optimally. When it's vibrating at its optimum level, then you're going to have the most tone. It also turns out that when you find that maximum resonancy point, that it also tends to be in tune at that point. So this helps intonation a lot. We've talked a little bit about this in the intonation chapter. But let me demonstrate what I mean by centering. Let's say I'm going up to this G. That note is not centered. It's above the center. That note does not come down to where it's more in the center of the sound. Much more free and round and richer in overtone content. I'm going to play it below the center. A great tone, frankly, is just a matter of 100% of the notes are centered. And sometimes I hear examples where some of the notes are centered and some of them are not centered. I've got notes that are above the center, I've got notes that are below the center, I've got a few notes that were more in the center. It doesn't sound like a good tone quality. To get that to sound good, I've got to have every note sound centered. Slightly above the center. Now when I center all those notes, I've got a completely different tone quality, and the intonation really straightens out. Intonation and tone really are joined at the hip. It is possible to manipulate a system so that you're playing in tune and not finding the tone. You can crunch things around and so on, but if you work on tone and you find that centered point where it's really resonant, at that point you're probably going to be well in tune as well. So I think this is a key to working on in both things. We've got on both issues. We've got to have it centered. And I think that a lot of students have trouble with this notion of centering. I have a diagram in the book where if you put the note in the middle, then it has room to round up so that you've got a round tone with high overtones, low overtones, all the middle overtones. It's a broad overtone spectrum. Whereas if I put the note up here, I kind of smash it on the ceiling. It thins out, goes sharp. It doesn't sound full. It's not good. I've mentioned that there is an overtone spectrum for each note. It turns out that when we play a note, this note actually is a combination, a composite of multiple notes. In fact, all these notes are in there a little bit. All those pitches are in that note. We're just not hearing them separately. Our ears hear it as an amalgamation, and we hear predominantly the fundamental, but we're hearing the thing that's affecting what the tone color is of our tone is what the spectrum is of all those overtones. In the physics lab, you can play on a spectrum analyzer, play on a microphone, and on an electronic bar graph, it'll show you this is how strong the first fundamental note is. Here's how strong the first overtone, second overtone, third overtone, fourth overtone, and so on. I've got this illustrated in the book. But we're looking for a rich harmonic recipe. We want lows so that lows and mids so that we have warmth and body, and then we want highs so that we have excitement, sizzle. We want some energy in the sound. We need a broad spectrum of overtones. If we play above the center, we're cutting out a lot of the low overtones. If we're playing below the center, we're cutting out a lot of the higher overtones. If we find the center, we're going to get a full spectrum of overtones. I think this is a huge part of developing our tone, is to find how to get more overtones in our sound. And really, this comes from playing all those warm-up exercises that we've talked about earlier. I'll come back to that. The spectrum analyzer is going to tell us those strengths of overtones. That's really what the difference is between flute and saxophone, between oboe and trumpet, is the overtone makeup, or the harmonic recipe of that note. But think about it this way, it's also the difference between two saxophone tones. Two saxophone players have two different tones. They've got two different harmonic spectrums. Now, of course, they're more roughly the same because they sound like a saxophone, but they have there's a little difference in there. And it's also the difference between a student having a good sound and then when he had a bad sound and when he has a good sound. One of them has a different harmonic spectrum than the other one. So a lot of the things that I'm going to show you in this chapter, exercises, are meant to develop the ability to increase the harmonic recipe, the breadth of overtones in the tone. I talk to my students about EQ. I say, have you ever EQ'd your maybe your car stereo, or you've got a stereo at home, and you turn up the treble, you turn down the bass, or turn up the bass and the treble. That's the same as turning up the volume knob. That's not the way to listen. But the point is that I actually have EQ controls here at the embouchure, in my oral cavity, and so on. Plus, there's a certain amount of EQ contribution from my instrument, from my neck, from my, in this case, the little freak, sound bridge. A certain amount of that's coming from the Silverstein ligature. Some of it's coming from my mouthpiece. Some of it's coming from my reed. It's a pretty complex situation. And we might have to work on all those issues, starting with getting good gear. But no matter what gear we have to be able to make progress. We can't say, well, wait till I get good gear to try to get a good tone. No, we get the tone with what we have. But then it becomes easier maybe with better gear. But what are my EQ controls? Well, in the embouchure, in the oral cavity, let's say I'm playing. I said, can you warm that up a little bit? Not so bright. I just changed some EQ controls. And the students kind of understand that analogy, and they can start working on, hey, can I EQ my sound a little bit differently? The EQ is way affected by just getting the right overtone spectrum and centering the note. But then we can additionally make subtle changes, embouchure, oral cavity, that can help with EQ in the note. Now, how do you work on this stuff? I've given a lot of ideas in the book, and I'm going to demonstrate the ones that need sound demonstrations here. The first idea, of course, is the overtone exercise on the warm-up page and the flexibility exercise on the warm-up page. These are huge for working on tone. I already mentioned this, but now what if I do the matching exercise? I'm going to play F as a regular F. I'm going to play F with the B flat fingering, no octave key. I'm going to match them. When we talked about intonation, I talked about matching the pitch. And I want to match those pitches straight across. That's changing a lot of stuff in my oral cavity. But I also want to try to match the tone. Now, the pitch of the regular fingering is much better than the overtone pitch, which is way sharp. So I have to bring that down. But the sound of the overtone sound is much thicker. And so I'm going to try to match my regular fingering to the thickness of the overtone sound. this really does help to fatten up your sound, get more overtone content. If I'm playing, let's say I'm doing the high D, and this also overblows from the low B flat fingering. It's fatter with the whole horn, the whole tube vibrating. Thinner there. I'm going to see if I can match as much as possible. Ah. Getting closer. It's fattening up that high D, which is usually kind of a thin sound. It's also bringing it down more into the center where it belongs. These are excellent exercises for working on tone. They help with the ability to control pitch and tone, actually. So I would remind you about all the exercises on the Overtone page. Oh, this one too. That's the exercise that gives me the ability to change pitch without loosening. If I can change my pitch without loosening, we talked about this extensively in the intonation video, so check that one out. But this gives me the ability to keep my embouchure focused, so I keep a tone while I bring the pitch down, and all of a sudden everything works way better. If I loosen here, I'm toast. I'm going to lose my sound. I never find the intonation before I lose my sound. And this is what happens to most people. They're not getting their tone consistent because they're loosening and tightening and loosening and lipping and round. Lipping is a thing of the past. You need to look at it that way. This is how we grow up with people talking about lip it up, lip it down, so on. We're not lipping. We're keeping the embouchure focused, and we're doing this with the tongue in the oral cavity. All those exercises on the Overtone page and mouthpiece pitch and all that stuff that we've talked about elsewhere, those all play into this in a strong way. We also talked about intonation in the intonation video. We talked about the long tone study where you do swells and where you try to crescendo, keep it from going flat, diminuendo, keep it from going sharp. That's another thing that's helping to create the control, EQ controls and pitch controls and so on in our oral cavity and our embouchure, so that it's really mostly in the oral cavity. As I said, the embouchure stays pretty solid. But there is a little bit of embouchure help there. The flute world deals with what they call the sonorite studies, which are by Louis Moïse, one of the great flute teachers. And this is where they take it. Moïse always started on a high B. Try to find the best sound I can on a high B. Not. Now, if I go down a half step, do I still have the same sound? Down another half step. And gradually we go down by half steps until we can get the same tone on every note. And then I might go back on the B and go up. What if I go? No, that's not the same tone. No. We find the sound where they're consistent with each other. No. No. So that's a sonorite exercise. I'm trying to hurry too much here. This is a long video, but we have to work down through the notes and try to get all the notes on the horn to sound the same. There's actually a Joe Henderson exercise. By the way, Joe played on a classical mouthpiece his whole life, but an important jazz player. But he would stand in the corner of the room. He was playing tenor. You know, tenor doesn't feed back to your ears quite the same way that alto and soprano do. And so he'd stand in the corner where he was getting bounce off the wall, and he could really hear himself well. And he would say, let me get a good B, but he'd start on the low B. Maybe it started like this. He'd work at it till he had that B. Singing. Sounds rich and full. Feels solid. That's called centering. And then he'd say, okay, now can I go up a note and keep that sound? No, not even close to the same sound. work back and forth until you could get the sound to sound the same. Oh my gosh, not even close. Getting those sounds to sound more the same as each other. Here's the acid test. Over the break. Yikes. Short tube to long tube. That's going to be pretty tough. You work at it until you can get all the tones to sound the same as each other. Very similar to the Moe study. The story is that Joe Henderson's dad would be sitting over in the easy chair reading the newspaper, and he'd say, "Not that one, fix that one." So we have to do that for ourselves. Here's another exercise that I really like. This is another flute exercise, but it works great on saxophone. I'm going to play an octave, and then I'm going to come down to minor third. I want to get the octave in tune and smooth change, go down to the minor third, and then I want to taper the minor third and see if I can make it taper out to nothing and keep the pitch constant. I'm going to start on a B again. Went a little sharp right on the end. And I mentioned the vibrato in the dynamics chapter. I wouldn't vibrato all the way out. As it's going down to nothing, I would get rid of the vibrato. And I'd also make the vibrato fit the width of the dynamic. So as the dynamic goes down, the vibrato gets narrower. I went a little sharp. More like that. It's a challenging exercise. It's good for pitch manipulation and for working on your tapers. I like that exercise a lot. I just call it the octave minor third exercise. You mentioned the double lip exercise. I have a lot of students that are into biting. They say, that might even sound good if you get used to it, but then you hear a real sound. Say, okay, I guess it wasn't that good a sound. No, because it's pinched. One of the things that I found useful in getting students to quit pinching is to do what I call what anybody would call the double lip exercise. So I'm going to put not on my lower lip over the teeth, and put my upper lip also over my teeth. Something about the upper lip that doesn't tolerate biting. It really makes you spread your teeth more, makes you open up a little bit. Now it's not going to sound great because you're not really in control, but make up the difference with you're making a bigger hole, so make up that difference with the support. Put a little more support under it. After I do that for about 15 minutes, then go back to teeth on the top of the mouthpiece and see if you can keep the same open feel. I've got a little bit more control. The sound's going to sound a little bit better, but it's helped me to stop biting. So I think that's a really good exercise too to help students with tone. Let me mention another one here. Play level from the middle. Now if I'm playing clarinet, I'm going to play level from the top. In fact, let me grab the clarinet. Show you what I mean. With the clarinet, we're playing at the top of the pitch range. Saxophone, we're playing more in the middle of the pitch range. I didn't really think about doing this on the clarinet, so I'm not warmed up on it. But let's say I'm playing this part in the Schumann fantasy piece. Excuse me. Well, if I blow down, when I get to the high D there, I don't want to blow down. I want to keep playing high D all the way down. Still playing high D. Still playing high D. If I let it go down, I get really spread. I have to blow level from the top. I'm blowing still the high D when I'm still down when I'm clear down in the low G. The saxophone's not like that. Let me get the alto back here. So with my students, I've found some success with comparing it and contrasting it to the clarinet, and also discussing playing level on the saxophone from the middle. Now the middle, I'm going to say, is around the top of the staff. D is actually the very middle of the horn, but I probably usually would start on a high F or a E. F's better, it's a little more stable note. Now find a good centered, open sound. Rich sound. Now here's what happens to most people going up the F major scale. I'm blowing up as I go up. No, keep blowing the F, the low F. When I'm working with a student on this, I'll hear this. Oh, you lost it on the D. Go back and get it on the D. Good. Now let's see if you can go to E. You lost it on the E. All right, let's see if we can get to F. No, no, no. I found a lot of success using that idea, that you blow level from the middle. You can do that with the F scale. Now let's do it with the E scale. No, you lost it on the A. You lost it on the C sharp. I go through a process like that till we can be consistent with blowing that lower effect, oral cavity, so on, more centered, and then keep it blowing middle level from the middle. That's huge in my mind. That helps so much getting those palm keys under control, where they're usually really played way too tight, way too high. I'm going to switch to my jazz mouthpiece to just for good measure, just to demonstrate some other things here, some of the other exercises. I could have done that with the Joe Henderson exercise. No. We have to work at this until we can play all the notes with the same sound. Low notes and high notes still have the same sound. They all have the same sound. I don't have a different sound in the low register than I do in the high register. Let me illustrate the Eric Marinothal exercise. I liked how Eric did this, so I've borrowed it. And he said, play the low G, and then open your embouchure until it just sags away. Okay, now this time take note on where you're at just before it sags away, where the last usable point is. Okay, I kind of feel where it is. All right, now go to that point and stabilize. By the way, first have the student play a G scale. They'll sound about like this. Okay, now play the G. Now we're going to go to the lowest point that seems usable and stabilize. If I go farther, it starts to sound saggy. We don't want that flabby, saggy sound. It's not usable. So I'm going to the lowest point without stepping over to that flabby sound. So now what I'm going to do is go down to that lowest point, stabilize, and then play the G scale again. different sound when I get down where I should be. Oleg's exercise is really similar to that. Some of you might know Oleg from the Olegature or the Bulldog sax stands and so on. A guy in LA that works on people's necks and got a lot of good products. Anyway, Oleg, I saw him work with a student at a North American Saxophone Alliance conference in Flagstaff, Arizona. And the student was a college student, came up and played Stella. It sounded about like this. Oleg said, no, play everything 5 cents flatter. I'll go another 5 cents flatter. The sound was starkly different, and you can hear it much bigger, much more overtone. You want a great lead alto sound. That's what you got to do. You got to blow down into the sound. It's almost like playing chicken. How deep can I blow without actually stepping into the line where I get saggy? And if I go farther, maybe I go another 5 cents flatter, and I find myself here. This is not usable. It's way too flabby, saggy at this point. So the lowest point I can find. Went a little bit too far on the G. But you get the idea. I'm kind of just hammering everything so you can hear it. But by playing 5 cents flatter, another 5 cents flatter, I can get the same kind of effect we were getting with the Marinothal exercise, where I'm blowing down more into the pitch. I love that exercise. I had a student come into a master class playing my one I love. I said, no, Stephen. We want all the sounds to sing. They only sing if they're centered, and that means we got to blow level, and we got to blow down deep, and then we got to blow level. That's kind of how that all comes together. Those are the exercises that I've recommended there. I got a number of other issues, but I realize that this video is getting too long. So I think we'll take a break, and I'll make a part 2 and maybe a part 3, because I want to show you some reed things in this video too, because sometimes it takes some reed fixing to help the tone. And I'm going to come back and show you that. But I've got a few other issues on tone that I want to show you. So let's take a break, and we'll be back in a few minutes.